Hey everybody, happy Memorial Day. This is a morning. I want to talk about Scandinavian shooting heads, and this is for my video series, The Ultimate Scandi Cast. Scandi Extreme for underhand casting. It's on Vimeo on demand. And one of my friends who bought it was kind enough to mention he wanted to know a little bit more about lines, so I thought I'd make an addendum to that video series for all you guys wanting to know more about Scandinavian shooting heads for Scandinavian style casting or underhand casting, as in my video series. So, first off, I don't think of them as Scandinavian shooting heads the way fly shop people might. I think of them as short shooting heads and really a Scandinavian. A lot of people, when they think of a Scandi head, Scandinavian shooting head, they think of this. This is Rio's Scandinavian shooting head. It's a full floating line. It's 33 feet long. This one is, to get my wife to read this to me, it's Rio Scandi shooting head, 36 feet, 450 grains. To me now, that's a long shooting head. But these are popular for people fishing the Deschutes in the summertime. But for my preference, it's a little too long. These, to me, if you're gonna fish one of these, Rio or Airflow, which I hear Airflow has gone out of the business of making Scandinavian heads, I don't know for sure. But if you're gonna be using these, then you want a 12 to 15 foot leader or even shorter, whatever. Like if you're just fishing on the Deschutes, warm water temperatures. But to me, this is a pretty long Scandi line. And probably you could put a poly leader, type of a sink tip, really, but it has a mono core. That's why they call them leaders. You know, they're just basically sink tips with a monofilament core. Some guys like to put those on. If you put one of those on here, you're gonna have to use, well, I'll say me. If I used one of these on a 13 or 14 foot rod and say had a 15 foot mono leader on it, then I would have to use a little bit more of a traditional spay cast than the little short abbreviated Scandi cast or bottom hand cast, because I'm pretty short myself and I wade deep, and then so you got a kind of a long Scandi line. So in my book, Scandi lines should be short. My favorite is the Rio Scandi Versatip. It's a Rio Scandi short body, and basically it's like the Rio Scandi short body, for all practical purposes, is like a little Skagit head. So this one is a size 8, and the body without any tips is about 20 feet long, and you can either add the 10-foot floating tip on it, or you can add 10 feet or 12 feet, whatever, of T8 or T11. If you want to do touch and go casting though, I don't like to go too heavy with the sink tip. But really, all a Scandinavian head is, to me, is a Skagit head that's underlined by about 100 grain. Say my 13-foot Deer Creek 7/8 is recommended 5 1/4, 525 Skagit. Then for a Scandi head, I might take a 400 grain Skagit, or 425 or 450, a Skagit shooting head of 20 feet, like a Rio Max short, or any number of 20-foot Skagit shooting heads. And instead of using 500 grains, I'll use 400, and then with a sink tip on it, and maybe not a terribly gnarly fly, weighted fly, you can do touch and go casting, and to me, that's your Scandinavian shooting head, is just a Skagit head that's 100 grains lighter. by and large. Okay. All a Skagit head is a Scandi head with about 10 or 15 feet chopped off the front end. Okay, so if I took this Rio Scandinavian shooting head, Rio Scandi head, whatever they call it, it's 36 feet, and chopped off 16 feet of it, it would be 20 feet long, and you could put a fairly skookum sink tip on. It would be a little bit like a Skagit line that maybe isn't quite as beefy, but the back end of these things are fairly beefy, okay? So you chop 15, 16 feet head off and loop it and add a sink tip, and then you've got a multi-tip Scandi line. Or you could just get a 400 grain, so you get a 350 grain Skagit head and add a floating tip, such as a floating bow tip or a Rio Replacement Tip, like this. This Rio Replacement Tip, it's a size 7, it's a 15-footer. A lot of guys will put these on a Commando, on an OPST Commando Skagit head. Say it's, you take a 13-foot Commando Skagit head, or 13 and a half or 12 and a half, and instead of a 10-foot sink tip, you put on a 15-foot Rio Replacement Tip, size 7, and then you have a longer, kind of a longer Scandi line. And that heavy Commando head with that long, fine tip, that makes a nice little floating outfit for, you know, swinging wet hackles or little woolly buggers, or soft hackles or wet flies, little, you know. So you can do that. For the kind of Scandi in my video, I prefer that 20-foot head with a 10-foot tip, floating or sinking. And then on a floating head, 15-foot leader, or shorter or longer, whatever you need for fishing. See, the Rio Scandi Versatip it's advertised that with the tip 33 feet, but if you measure it, it's actually a foot or two shorter. So that is just a really screaming shooting head system. It's got the floating head, or throw on a sink tip. I don't like to use poly leaders and versa leaders on the end of a Scandi line. That makes it too long for Scandi casting. You gotta do a normal spay cast. And if I'm gonna do a normal spay cast and I want a long line, then would rather go with a Gale Force 15-meter shooting head. I either like my lines really long, or really fairly long, or really short. So when I did the OPST Commando, I can't remember the name of that little 8-weight double-hander that OPST made, I put on a Commando groove and then a light sink tip, and that thing was just great to touch and go cast with. And you can use your Scandi stroke and do waterboard cast too, if that's your preference. The next cast, this is a fall favorite. It's not a fall favorite, it's a winter authority. It's the driver of a winter authority. I think it's a 30 or 35, but this is for all practical purposes, a 20-foot Skagit head. And it's designed by Simon, really lovely. It's pretty Skagit-y, but it's also not too much like a big fat bullet. It's really nice, great turnover with the floating. It comes with a floating head, I believe, in the Winter Authority 35 version that you take off, and then you put the sink tip on if you want to do touch and go cast with a really nice shooting head. I just think of them as shooting heads, not as much Scandi or Skagit. Another great option, it's really overlooked, is this. It's the Steve Godshall Scandit. And Steve Godshall I'll try to put his information in the description, is a line designer and rod designer and engineer guy. And these little Scandi shooting heads, they have a removable tip, or you can have a floating tip or a sink tip on it. You can do touch and go casting with them. They are designed, they're custom made. So you call Steve and you tell him what you want. Tell him your height, tell him your casting style, you know, tell him what you want. And he'll custom make one for your size, for your kind of fishing you want to do, for the flies you want to fish, for the fish you want to target. It's a great deal. He's super nice guy, super knowledgeable, and he can make you the right shooting head for Scandinavian casting, for underhand casting. Then we have the bridge. It's the bridge tributary, and my friend Nate Whiteman runs him, sent me his 12-foot Bruce and Walker to cast and try out, and he sent this bridge tributary. So with this though, it's long enough, it's a little bit longer for a Scandi line. For a 12-footer, you find yourself using more traditional spey cast, but like for like a 14 or 15-footer, this would probably make a really nice Scandinavian shooting head, a floating line. And if I have a floater like this, I don't want to mess with a poly leader or versa leader. If I'm going to use a poly leader or versa leader, I would just use it on a Skagit head or on a Rio Skagit short body. That's a really nice little shooting head, the Skagit short body. You can put a 10 or 15-foot floating or sink tip on it, and if you keep things light, you can do your touch and go casting, okay? Use strict underhand though, where you're starting your lift at your hip and just doing the little circle with the bottom hand. You want to keep them short, so you might want a longer rod. I like 30-foot, either combination multiple tip shooting heads or floating heads with no poly leader or versa leader. That's what I meant to say, versa leader, poly leader. Those two things are just basically sink tips with monocores. I don't give them much thought. I like the poly leaders because they say fast, super duper sinking fast. You know, those, if you want to use those on a multiple tip Scandi head, you can. If you can find something by guideline or loop, I've not used those, but those are designed by Loop. I think Klaus Freemore designs those, and anything with I've heard the Goran Anderson lines are really nice, but I don't know, I don't have any experience with those, but hopefully I will soon. For that short little abbreviated underhand Scandi cast, I like a short shooting head. So I hope that is clear as mud. Next cast zone, I think it's called. It's basically a Skagit head that half of it is a sink tip. And I did some casting with it this weekend. This zone, hang on a second. Look how fat this thing is on the butt end. This is like huge on the butt end. It's 13 feet of Skagit head with an integrated, built-in, that's what integrated means to me, sink tip. The sink tip's about 10 feet from our estimations, and the floating part is like 13 feet. And this thing, we fished it without a sink tip. So we're fishing a 23-foot shooting head with 4 feet of mono and a weighted fly. And this thing just bombs, it just flies. And you can, if you underline this, so if I put this one is 450 grains, if I put this on a 6-weight, it would be a Skagit head that I would probably add a little sink tip to. If I put it on a 7-weight, like I did this weekend, it would become a Scandinavian shooting head, and we didn't use a sink tip, so it's 23 feet long. with 4 feet of mono and a weighted fly. And you can do a very short, casting stroke. You can do a strict Gordon Anderson underhand casting stroke with this line, and it flies really good. You're gonna have to do some stripping though, because it goes a long ways. It's really fun, it's really easy. But you could also put a 10 or 12 foot sink tip on it and have a longer line so you don't have to do as much stripping, and you can probably really get down deep. So this is another option. I just look for short shooting heads. Those are my Scandi heads. Anyway, happy Memorial Day, and God bless those who gave their lives and sacrificed from their lives to offer us this freedom. Thanks to you vets.